Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Psychiatric hospitals in the 70s weren't what people imagine today. They were isolated fortresses, where experimental treatments happened behind locked doors and nobody asked questions. My residency at Clearwater Psychiatric Institute started right after medical school, when 26 still felt old enough to change the world, but young enough to trust the wrong people. The facility occupied 40 acres of pine forest in Northern California, about 2 hours from Sacramento, housing 300 patients separated into wings based on diagnosis and severity. Dr. Gregory Hoffman ran the women's ward where I'd been assigned, a man approaching his 60s with silver hair perpetually slicked back, and these pale gray eyes that held your gaze without blinking, like he was reading something written on the inside of your skull. My duties seemed routine at first: patient evaluations, medication rounds, behavioral documentation, all the standard tasks that would supposedly prepare me for running my own practice one day. The other residents complained about the isolation, the outdated equipment, the way certain doors stayed locked even to medical staff, but I figured every hospital had its quirks and protocols. Everything shifted one October evening when Dr. Hoffman kept me after my shift ended, leading me through parts of the building my keycard had never opened before. We passed 2 security checkpoints, where guards examined special clearance badges I didn't know existed, then descended a stairwell into a basement corridor with no windows and fluorescent tubes that buzzed like angry wasps trapped in the ceiling. He explained I'd been selected for a classified research project with federal funding, revolutionary trauma treatment that could transform our understanding of how the human mind processes and releases psychological damage. The way he presented it felt almost religious. We would administer controlled doses of lysergic acid diethylamide to female patients with severe emotional trauma, using the drug's properties to essentially dissolve the barriers their minds had built around traumatic memories, allowing us to guide them through reprocessing these experiences in a controlled therapeutic environment. He produced a manila folder thick with consent forms, each one signed and notarized, assuring me that every legal requirement had been satisfied, though the sensitive nature of the research meant absolute discretion, even from colleagues who weren't part of what he called the project team. The first session I observed took place in a room they'd converted from an old surgical theater. White walls, one-way observation glass, and a reclining chair that looked more like a dentist's setup than anything psychiatric. The patient was Diane, 32 years old, admitted for severe depression after losing her daughter in a drowning accident 3 years prior. Dr. Hoffman administered the LSD through a sugar cube, precisely dosed at 200 micrograms, while I monitored her vitals and took notes on the special forms they'd designed for the project. Within 40 minutes, Diane's pupils dilated until her brown eyes looked almost black, and she began describing colors bleeding through the walls like watercolors in rain. Dr. Hoffman guided her with this steady hypnotic voice, asking her to revisit the day of the accident, to walk through it frame by frame while the drug dismantled whatever defensive walls her mind had built. She started crying, then laughing, then making these sounds I'd never heard from a human throat, something between singing and wailing that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. What disturbed me wasn't just the intensity of her reaction, but how Dr. Hoffman responded to it, leaning forward with this expression of fascination while scribbling notes in shorthand I couldn't read. He increased the dose for the next session without consulting me, pushing it to 350 micrograms, explaining that we needed to break through the resistance to reach the actual trauma. During that second session, Diane clawed at her arms until she drew blood, convinced that insects were crawling beneath her skin, carrying messages from her dead daughter. I wanted to intervene, to give her something to calm the hallucinations, but Dr. Hoffman grabbed my wrist and held it with surprising strength, telling me that interrupting the process would invalidate months of preparation. Two other doctors I'd never seen before watched from behind the observation glass, taking their own notes, occasionally speaking into tape recorders they held close to their mouths. By the third week, we had 12 women participating in the project, each one dealing with different traumas: sexual assault, childhood abuse, loss of children, domestic violence that had left both physical and psychological scars. The sessions grew longer, sometimes stretching 8 or 9 hours, with doses that would have been considered dangerous in any legitimate therapeutic setting. Dr. Hoffman introduced what he called guided reconstruction, where he would suggest new narratives while the patients were deep in their hallucinations, trying to overwrite their traumatic memories with fabricated ones. He'd tell a woman who'd been raped that it had been a dream, that she'd actually spent that night safe in her childhood bedroom, and in their altered state, some of them would begin to believe it, at least temporarily. The morning after these sessions, the confusion in their eyes when reality reasserted itself was painful to witness. They'd look at me like drowning people reaching for something solid, but I had no answers that would help them make sense of what was real anymore. The night everything went wrong, we were working with a patient named Janet, a 28-year-old who'd been admitted after multiple suicide attempts following a miscarriage. She'd been in the program for 2 weeks, and Dr. Hoffman had been pushing her doses higher each session, convinced he was close to what he called a breakthrough moment. That evening, he gave her 500 micrograms, more than double a standard therapeutic dose, while soft classical music played through speakers mounted in the ceiling corners. For the first hour, Janet lay still on the reclined chair, her eyes moving rapidly behind closed lids like she was in REM sleep, occasionally mumbling words I couldn't make out. Then her breathing changed, becoming these deep rhythmic pants like a woman in labor, and her hands moved to her stomach, pressing and kneading the flesh through her hospital gown. Dr. Hoffman leaned forward in his chair, that familiar gleam of fascination brightening his gray eyes as he began speaking to Janet in a low, measured tone, telling her she was safe, that she was bringing life into the world, that everything was happening exactly as it should. Janet's movements became more agitated, her fingers clawing at the hospital gown until she'd torn it open, revealing her pale stomach covered in old self-harm scars that looked like a map of her suffering. She kept repeating, "The baby's coming, the baby's coming," her voice rising with each repetition until it became a shriek that echoed off the white walls. I reached for the sedatives we kept prepared, but Dr. Hoffman raised his hand to stop me, insisting we needed to let the experience complete itself, that interrupting now would cause psychological fragmentation. Behind the observation glass, the two unnamed doctors had pressed closer, one of them filming with a small camera I hadn't noticed before, capturing every moment of Janet's unraveling. What happened next still appears in my nightmares, vivid as the moment I witnessed it. Janet's fingers, still convinced she was delivering a child, began tearing at her abdomen with her fingernails, ripping through skin with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. Blood spread across the white leather of the chair, pooling beneath her, and she was laughing. This horrible, joyous laughter like she'd accomplished something miraculous. Dr. Hoffman finally moved then, but not to help her. He grabbed my shoulders and positioned me between himself and Janet, using me as a shield while shouting for the security guards. By the time they restrained her and I managed to stop the bleeding with compression and emergency sutures, she'd carved deep gashes across her stomach, muttering about holding her baby, asking why we'd taken it away when she'd worked so hard to bring it back. The aftermath was chaos disguised as protocol. Nurses appeared from nowhere to transfer Janet to the medical wing. Documents were signed and countersigned, and Dr. Hoffman spoke in hushed tones with the observers who packed up their recording equipment with practiced efficiency. Nobody would tell me Janet's condition beyond stable, and when I tried to check on her the next morning, I found her room empty, the bed stripped down to the mattress, no record in the system that she'd ever been transferred to medical. Dr. Hoffman called me into his office that afternoon, sliding a stack of papers across his mahogany desk, a non-disclosure agreement that went on for pages, full of legal language about federal classification and penalties for unauthorized disclosure that included prison time. He reminded me about my student loans, about how the project's funding included a generous bonus that would clear my debts, about how my participation would be noted favorably in my residency evaluation. His gray eyes never blinked as he explained that Janet had been transferred to a specialized facility for intensive care, that her family had been notified, that everything was being handled according to established protocols. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, about the 11 other women still in the program, about the doses that kept climbing, and the observers with their cameras and tape recorders. That night, I snuck back into the restricted wing using my access card, planning to copy patient files to find some evidence of what was really happening. The filing room was exactly where I expected, but when I opened the cabinet marked with our project code, I found something that made my chest tighten with panic. Hundreds of files, dating back years before the program supposedly started, each one documenting similar experiments with different drugs, different methods, but always the same focus on female patients with trauma. The earliest files were from 1965, and at the bottom of each one was a stamp I recognized from news articles about congressional hearings. MK Ultra Sub-Project 58, Psychochemical Vulnerability Studies. I grabbed as many files as I could carry, stuffing them into my medical bag, knowing I had minutes before security did their rounds. The documents painted a picture of systematic experimentation that made my stomach churn. Women who'd been given massive doses of LSD combined with electroshock therapy, others subjected to sensory deprivation while hallucinating, detailed notes about personality reconstruction and memory dissolution that read more like science fiction than medicine. One file contained photographs that I wish I could forget. Women with vacant eyes, some catatonic, others clearly in states of permanent psychosis, all marked as project outcomes unsuccessful. The most recent file was dated just 3 days ago, and when I opened it, Janet's admission photo stared back at me. But the status section was stamped with something that made no sense. Subject relocated, Montreal facility, further testing required. I photographed everything with the small camera I'd bought for documenting patient progress, my fingers trembling so badly I had to retake several shots. The next morning, I arrived at work to find my keycard deactivated and 2 federal agents waiting in the lobby with Dr. Hoffman, who wouldn't meet my eyes as they explained I was being transferred immediately to a VA hospital in Texas, that my residency would continue there with full credit, that my moving expenses would be covered. They made it clear this wasn't a request. My apartment had already been packed, my belongings were in a truck, and a plane ticket was waiting at the airport. The agents escorted me to my car, one of them mentioning casually that they knew about my late-night visit to the filing room, that the cameras had captured everything, but they were willing to overlook it if I honored my agreements and relocated quietly. Dr. Hoffman disappeared 2 days after I left. I heard through medical school contacts that he'd simply vanished. His office cleaned out overnight, no forwarding address, like he'd never existed at all. I kept those photographs hidden for years, moving them from one safe deposit box to another, too terrified to release them but unable to destroy the only proof I had that those women weren't imagining their nightmares. Eventually, I reached out to a journalist investigating MK Ultra projects, giving him copies of everything under the condition of anonymity, and while he published articles about government-funded LSD experiments, Clearwater Institute was never mentioned by name. It had been shuttered and demolished by then, replaced by a shopping complex as if 40 acres of pine forest had never held those buildings at all. I tracked down 3 of the women from the project through medical records and careful searching. 2 were in long-term psychiatric facilities, their minds never fully recovering from what we'd done, and the 3rd had changed her name and moved to Canada, refusing to speak with me when I finally found her number. Janet was nowhere in any system I could access, as if she'd been erased from existence completely, though sometimes I wonder if that Montreal facility stamp meant something darker than just a transfer. I finished my residency in Texas, built a small practice, tried to help people the right way, but I never stopped carrying the weight of those months at Clearwater. The camera I used to photograph those files sits in my desk drawer, the film long since developed and hidden away, a reminder of how easily medical ethics can be abandoned when someone promises you're serving a greater purpose. Whenever a patient talks about trusting their doctor completely, about putting their mental health in someone else's hands, I remember Janet's screams, the blood on that white chair, and Dr. Hoffman's gray eyes watching it all with scientific detachment. The truth is, I got away because they let me go. I was small, insignificant, just a resident who could be relocated and silenced with the right combination of threats and incentives. The real architects of that project, the ones who funded it and collected the data, they're probably still out there. Their names hidden behind classified stamps and government clearance levels I'll never have access to. I worked as an intern at Riverside State Hospital in Illinois during the spring of 2018, fresh out of my master's program and eager to make a difference in psychiatric care. At 26, I thought I understood how the system worked, the protocols, the hierarchies, the way things had to be done for everyone's safety. My supervisor, Dr. Harold Brennan, had been there for 32 years and ran the long-term ward with the efficiency of a military operation. Every morning I'd arrive at 7 sharp, badge in through 3 security checkpoints, and spend my days reviewing patient files, sitting in on group therapy sessions, and learning the careful dance of institutional psychiatry. The building itself was a relic from the 1950s, all pale green walls and narrow windows with wire mesh, the kind of place where footsteps echoed down empty corridors long after the person had passed. Among the 43 patients in our ward, one stood out to me from my first week: Robert Garrison, a 61-year-old man who'd been there for 11 years. Unlike the others who shuffled through their routines with vacant stares or muttered to invisible companions, Robert was articulate, almost desperately so. Every time I passed his room during rounds, he'd be at his small desk, writing letters to lawyers who never wrote back, filling yellow legal pads with meticulous notes about his case. His room was organized like a law office, newspaper clippings taped to the walls in chronological order, court documents filed in makeshift folders he'd fashioned from commissary paper bags, everything dated and cross-referenced. He claimed he'd been framed for his wife's murder, that someone had planted evidence and manipulated his confession, and while every patient had their story, there was something about the precision of his arguments that made me pause during those early morning rounds. It was a Thursday in May when I decided to pull Robert's court files from the archive room in the basement. Dr. Brennan was at a conference in Chicago, and I told myself I was just being thorough, learning about our patients' histories to better understand their conditions. The archive room smelled like mildew and old paper, rows of metal filing cabinets stretching back into darkness where the overhead fluorescents had burned out years ago. Robert's file was thick as a phone book, crammed with psychiatric evaluations, police reports, and trial transcripts from 2007. His wife, Catherine, had been found dead in their bathtub, drowned after being struck on the head with a ceramic lamp from their bedroom. The prosecution's case seemed solid: Robert's fingerprints on the lamp, neighbors who heard them arguing that night, and most damning, his own detailed confession given 3 days after the murder during a therapy session with Dr. Milton Cross, a specialist in recovered memory techniques who'd been brought in by the police. But as I read through the confession transcript by the light of my phone's flashlight, something strange jumped out at me. The language didn't match Robert's speaking patterns at all. The confession was full of psychiatric jargon and clinical terms that a high school math teacher wouldn't naturally use. Phrases like dissociative episode and affective dysregulation peppered the document, and the description of the murder read like something from a forensic textbook rather than a person recounting their own actions. I found the audio recording reference number at the bottom of the page and searched through the evidence boxes until I located an old cassette tape labeled R. Garrison, Session 3, May 15, 2007. My heart was pounding as I climbed back upstairs to find a player, borrowing one from the occupational therapy room where they still use tapes for relaxation exercises. The tape was horrifying to listen to, not because of what Robert said, but because of how he said it. Dr. Cross's voice was smooth and insistent, guiding Robert through what he called a therapeutic hypnosis session to unlock suppressed memories. For the first 20 minutes, Robert sounded drowsy, almost drugged, responding to questions about his childhood, his marriage, mundane details about his daily routine. Then Cross's questioning shifted, became more directed. "You were angry that night, weren't you, Robert? Catherine had been seeing someone else. You picked up the lamp from the nightstand. You can see yourself doing it now, can't you?" And Robert's voice, flat and monotone like someone reading from a script they didn't understand, began describing the murder in that clinical language I'd found so jarring in the transcript. Every few minutes you could hear Cross saying, "That's good, Robert, go deeper now, tell me what you see." By the end of the 90-minute tape, Robert had confessed to a murder that sounded more like Cross's interpretation of events than any genuine memory. I spent the entire weekend researching Dr. Milton Cross online, and what I found made my skin prickle with unease. He'd been involved in at least 6 other cases between 2004 and 2009, where defendants had given similarly detailed confessions under hypnosis, all using that same clinical vocabulary, all later convicted based primarily on those confessions. 2 of those defendants had killed themselves in prison. 1 had been declared incompetent to stand trial after a mental breakdown, and the others were serving life sentences. Cross himself had disappeared from public records after 2009, though I found an obituary from 2011 saying he'd died in a car accident in Nevada. But here's what really got to me. In each case, Cross had been hired as a consultant, not by the defense or the prosecution, but by a private firm called Behavioral Solutions, Inc., which had contracts with various police departments for specialized interrogation support. The company had dissolved in 2010, just months after Cross's last documented case. Monday morning, I arrived at work an hour early, my laptop bag heavy with printed articles and copies I'd made of Robert's file at a 24-hour copy shop. I planned to present everything to Dr. Brennan, convince him we needed to contact Robert's public defender, maybe even reach out to the Innocence Project. Robert must have sensed something different about me when I stopped by his room during morning rounds, because he looked up from his writing with an expression I'd never seen before. Hope, raw and desperate. "You found something," he said. Not a question, but a statement, and I nodded slightly, whispering that I was working on it, that he needed to stay calm and give me a few days. The way his eyes filled with tears, the way he gripped his pencil so tight it snapped in half. I'll never forget that moment. I spent the rest of my shift documenting everything meticulously, creating a detailed report with timestamps from the tape, citations from Cross's other cases, and a formal recommendation for case review. But when I came in Wednesday morning, everything had changed. Robert wasn't at his desk when I passed his room. He was sitting on his bed, staring at the wall, a line of drool running down his chin. The charge nurse, Beverly, informed me that Robert had experienced an acute psychotic episode on Monday night, becoming violent and attacking an orderly, though she seemed confused when I asked for details about which orderly and what exactly had happened. Dr. Brennan had authorized an emergency procedure, a transorbital lobotomy, performed Tuesday afternoon by a visiting surgeon whose name wasn't in any of our staff directories. When I frantically searched for my report in the hospital's digital system, it was gone, not even in the deletion records. My key card no longer opened the archive room, and when I tried to log into my account from home that evening, my credentials had been revoked. Dr. Brennan left me a voicemail saying my internship was being terminated due to breach of patient confidentiality protocols, and that I should return my badge by Friday. I couldn't just walk away. Thursday night, I convinced Jamal, an orderly who'd always been friendly with me, to meet me at a diner off Route 47. He was nervous, kept checking the parking lot through the window, but after 3 cups of coffee and my promise that I'd never mention his name, he told me what he knew. There had been no violent episode Monday night. Robert had been sedated right after dinner, taken directly to the medical wing. Jamal had seen two men in suits wheeling Robert's gurney, men he'd never seen before who had visitor badges but somehow had keys to the restricted areas. More disturbing, Jamal mentioned that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Over his 8 years at Riverside, he'd seen at least 4 other patients who'd been trying to appeal their cases suddenly have episodes requiring immediate surgical intervention. Always when Dr. Brennan was conveniently away or occupied, always with visiting surgeons who vanished afterward, always with paperwork that somehow got filed incorrectly or lost entirely. The next morning, I drove back to the hospital one last time, not to return my badge, but to see Robert. Security tried to stop me, but I told them I'd left personal items in my desk and had Dr. Brennan's permission, a lie that bought me maybe 10 minutes. I found Robert in the day room, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, his eyes vacant and unfocused. The precise, articulate man who'd fought for 11 years to prove his innocence was gone. When I knelt beside him and said his name, he turned toward me slowly, a bit of recognition flickering somewhere deep behind his eyes. "Catherine," he whispered, and then nothing more. On my way out, I passed Dr. Brennan in the hallway, and he stopped me with a hand on my shoulder, his grip just a bit too firm. "Some patients," he said quietly, "are here because the system knows exactly where they belong. It's unfortunate when young idealists don't understand the bigger picture. I trust you'll be discreet about your time here, for your own career's sake." I spent weeks trying to find someone who would listen. Legal aid organizations, journalism departments at universities, even the ACLU. But without the original documents, without access to Robert's files, I had nothing but my word against a respected state institution. The cassette tape I'd listened to supposedly never existed, according to official records. The copy shop where I'd made duplicates had a convenient fire in their storage room 2 days after my visit, destroying their security footage and machine records. 3 months later, I received a letter from the state licensing board saying they'd received a complaint about my unprofessional conduct during my internship, and that any attempt to pursue psychiatric credentials would be subject to extensive review. I took a job in medical billing, as far from patient care as I could get, but I kept every note I'd made, every screenshot I'd managed to take before my access was revoked. Everything stored in multiple cloud accounts under different names. Last month, 5 years after that nightmare at Riverside, I got an unexpected email from Jamal. Robert had died of pneumonia in the hospital ward, forgotten and silent to the end. But Jamal had something else to tell me. Beverly, the charge nurse, was retiring and had been cleaning out old files from her personal cabinet. She'd found something wedged behind a drawer, something that must have fallen back there years ago. A partial photocopy of Dr. Cross's original session notes with Robert, handwritten observations that never made it into the official transcript. In the margins, Cross had written, "Subject resistant to suggestion, increased sodium pentothal dosage. Narrative implanted successfully after 3rd attempt. Client satisfied with results." Below that, a phone number with a note. "Contact H. Brennan for remaining payment." Beverly was scared, didn't want trouble, but she'd given the paper to Jamal before destroying it. He sent me a photo before burning it himself, too afraid to keep evidence. I still have that photo, encrypted and hidden. The only proof that Robert Garrison spent 11 years in a psychiatric hospital for a murder someone else committed, lobotomized not for violence, but for refusing to stop proclaiming his innocence. Sometimes I wonder how many others are sitting in institutions right now, their truths dissolved by chemicals and scalpels, their stories buried in basement archives that no one will ever search. I never thought I'd be writing about Kyle here, but after what the police showed me last week, I need to get this out there. Maybe someone can make sense of it, because I sure can't. Kyle Brenner was my roommate for 2 years while we both attended film school in Boston. He dropped out in 2022 to focus on his YouTube channel, paranormal investigations, urban exploration, that kind of content. The guy was obsessed with abandoned places, especially ones with dark histories. He'd spend hours researching locations, digging through old newspaper archives, tracking down former employees or patients. His channel had around 40,000 subscribers. Nothing huge, but enough that he was making decent money from sponsors and memberships. That night in early December, he told me he'd found the perfect location for his biggest live stream yet, some abandoned psychiatric hospital about 3 hours north of the city. The place was called Whitmore State Hospital, and Kyle had been researching it for months. Over dinner that week, he couldn't stop talking about what he'd uncovered. The hospital operated from 1923 to 1986, but what made it notorious were the experimental procedures they performed in the 1940s. Apparently, some doctor named Clarence Whitmore, yeah, they named it after him, had been performing lobotomies before they were even officially approved. But these weren't just regular lobotomies. Kyle showed me these photocopies of old medical journals where other doctors had criticized Whitmore's techniques as unnecessarily invasive and ethically questionable, which in 1940s medical speak probably meant absolutely horrifying. The state shut down that whole wing in 1947 after several patients died, but the hospital kept operating for another 40 years. Kyle had this whole folder of documentation, including building blueprints he'd somehow gotten from a contact at the county records office. The night of December 8th, Kyle set up his streaming equipment in our living room for a final check before heading out. He had 2 cameras, his main DSLR and a backup GoPro strapped to his chest, plus 3 different flashlights, backup batteries, and his phone as a mobile hotspot for the stream. I remember him adjusting the settings on his laptop, making sure the stream quality would hold up even with a weak signal. He'd promoted this live stream for weeks on his channel, calling it the Whitmore Investigation, live and unfiltered. By the time he went live at 9 p.m., there were already about 3,000 people waiting in the chat. I watched the first few minutes from my room. Kyle was in his car, driving through this thick fog, explaining the history of the place to his viewers. He mentioned that the surgical wing where Whitmore did his experiments had been sealed since 1947, but he'd found a maintenance tunnel that might lead inside. The chat was going crazy with excitement, people sending donations, asking him to check specific rooms. I actually fell asleep around 10:30 that night, while Kyle was still streaming. From what I've pieced together from the archived footage and chat logs the police showed me, he reached the hospital around 10:15. The building looked exactly like you'd expect. Broken windows, graffiti everywhere, vines crawling up the brick walls. Kyle spent about 20 minutes just walking around the outside, showing his viewers the different wings, reading old signs that were barely visible in the darkness. The main entrance had been boarded up, but he found a side door that had been pried open, probably by other urban explorers or vandals. The first floor was mostly administrative offices, nothing too interesting except for some old patient files scattered around that he didn't touch, saying something about respecting privacy even decades later. It was when he found the stairwell to the basement that things started getting weird. The chat logs show that around 11 p.m., viewers started commenting that they were hearing something in the background of his audio, like a low humming or droning sound that Kyle apparently couldn't hear through his earbuds. The basement was where the old surgical wing connected to the main building. Kyle's flashlight kept catching these long shadows down the corridors, and the walls were lined with those old mint green tiles that hospitals used back then, most of them cracked or fallen off completely. According to the stream footage, he spent about 15 minutes navigating through what looked like a maze of hallways, following his blueprint by the light of his phone screen. The chat was getting more and more agitated. People kept saying they were seeing something moving in the peripheral edges of his camera frame, always just out of direct view. One user, Brooklyn Ghost 22, typed in all caps that there was definitely someone else down there with him. Kyle either wasn't reading the chat or was ignoring it for dramatic effect. He kept narrating what he was seeing: old gurneys pushed against walls, rooms with rusted bed frames, a nurse's station with medication logs still sitting on the desk from 1986. Then he found it, a heavy metal door with Surgical Suite B stamped on a brass plate. The door had been chained shut, but the chain was old and rusted. Kyle pulled out a crowbar from his backpack. The timestamp on the video shows 11:47 p.m. when Kyle finally got the chain off. The door scraped against the floor as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through his microphone and making several viewers comment that it sounded like screaming. Inside, the surgical room was bizarrely well preserved. There was this operating table in the center, still with its leather straps hanging down, and cabinets along the walls filled with old medical instruments. Kyle panned his camera slowly across the room, and that's when it happened, when everyone saw it. In the corner behind a tall medical cabinet with glass doors, there was clear movement. Not like a shadow or a trick of the light, but something solid ducking out of view. The chat exploded. People were typing, "Get out," and behind the cabinet so fast the messages were just a blur on the screen. Kyle walked closer to investigate, saying something about it probably being a raccoon or another explorer. His camera was focused on the cabinet when viewers started screaming in the chat about his chest cam footage. The GoPro was picking up something his main camera wasn't. In that footage, which the police enhanced and showed me, you can see what looks like fingers gripping the edge of another cabinet about 10 feet to Kyle's left, like someone was peering around it. Kyle never saw those fingers. He was completely focused on the first cabinet, pulling it away from the wall to check behind it. When he did, there was nothing there except old water damage and peeling paint. But the chat was going absolutely insane. The viewer count had jumped to almost 8,000 people, and donations were pouring in with messages begging him to leave immediately. Someone donated $50 with the message, "Please just run now." Kyle finally glanced at his phone to check the chat, and you could see him pause, probably reading all the warnings. He laughed more, and said something like, "Come on guys, you're letting your imagination get the best of you. It's just an old building." That's when he decided to explore the adjoining room through a doorway on the far side of the surgical suite. The doorway led to what looked like a prep room, with old sinks and metal tables. As he walked through, his main camera started getting this weird interference. These horizontal lines rolling up the screen every few seconds. Kyle blamed it on the old electrical wiring possibly still having some residual charge, which made no sense, but he kept going. The prep room connected to a narrow hallway with 3 doors. Kyle tried the first 2, both locked solid, wouldn't budge even with his crowbar. The third door was slightly ajar. The timestamp shows 12:14 a.m. when he pushed it open. Inside was what Kyle identified as Whitmore's personal office, based on a nameplate still sitting on the desk. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets along one wall. There were papers everywhere, like someone had dumped out all the files decades ago. Kyle set his main camera on the desk to get a wide shot while he looked through some of the papers with his flashlight. That's when the stream started getting really strange. The viewers could see Kyle examining documents, but behind him, in the doorway he'd just come through, there was a shadow that didn't match anything in the room. The shadow would appear for a few seconds, then disappear, then reappear slightly closer. One viewer managed to screenshot it and enhance the image. They said it looked like someone in old medical scrubs standing perfectly still. But here's the truly disturbing part. Kyle's voice started echoing. Not like a normal echo in an empty room, but his words from earlier in the stream were repeating faintly in the background. Viewers could hear him saying, "Just an old building," over and over, getting slightly louder each time. At 12:31 a.m., Kyle picked up his camera from the desk and turned around to leave the office. The doorway was empty, nothing blocking his path. But when he stepped into the hallway, his flashlight died, just went completely black. The camera's night vision kicked in, showing everything in that greenish-gray tint, and that's when viewers saw what Kyle couldn't see in the darkness. There were people in the hallway, not one person, but 3 or 4 figures standing completely motionless at different points along the corridor. They were all facing the walls, their heads pressed against them like children being punished. Kyle pulled out his backup flashlight, and the second the beam hit the hallway, The figures were gone. Not like they ran away. The video shows they just weren't there anymore the instant the light touched where they'd been standing. Kyle muttered something about the night vision playing tricks, but his voice was shaking now. He started walking faster, trying to retrace his steps back to the surgical suite. The chat was in complete chaos. People were begging him to call the police, to get out any way he could. The viewer count had hit 12,000. Someone kept spamming "they're following you" over and over. Kyle made it back to the surgical suite, but something was wrong with the room. In the stream footage, viewers could see that all the medical instruments in the cabinets had been rearranged. What had been random placement before was now organized into perfect rows, all the sharp edges pointing outward toward the center of the room. Kyle didn't notice or didn't comment on it. He was focused on getting back to the basement corridor. But as he crossed the room, his GoPro picked up audio that the main camera missed. It was breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing that seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. The enhanced audio the police played for me was even worse. Underneath the breathing, you could hear what sounded like metal scraping against tile, like something being dragged. Kyle reached the door to the main basement corridor at 12:43 a.m. He grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't open. Not locked. The handle turned fine, but it was like something was holding it shut from the other side. Kyle put the camera down and used both hands, really yanking on it. The chat feed shows viewers screaming at him to look behind him. In his camera view, that operating table in the center of the room. Its leather straps were now standing straight up, defying gravity, reaching toward the ceiling like fingers. That's when the stream started cutting out. The video would freeze for a second, go to static, then come back. Each time it returned, Kyle seemed to be in a slightly different position in the room, like frames were missing. In one return, he was at the door. Next, he was back by the operating table, then by the cabinets. He didn't seem aware of these jumps. He kept talking as if nothing was happening, still trying to get the door open. But his words weren't matching his mouth movements anymore. The audio was delayed, or maybe it was from earlier, viewers couldn't tell. At 12:51 a.m., the stream stabilized for about 30 seconds. Kyle had given up on the door and was trying to smash through the glass of one of the windows high up on the wall. He'd stacked 2 gurneys and was standing on them, hitting the glass with his crowbar. The chat shows multiple people pointing out that his shadow on the wall had too many arms. The enhanced footage confirms it. His shadow showed 4 arms instead of 2, with the extra ones hanging limp at wrong angles. Then viewers heard Kyle's voice, clear as day, saying, "Don't turn off the light. Don't turn off the light." But his mouth wasn't moving. He was still smashing at the window, completely silent except for the impact sounds, while his voice repeated that phrase over and over from somewhere else in the room. At exactly 1 a.m., everything went white. Not static, not black, pure white. The stream stayed that way for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The chat was still active, thousands of people typing, asking what happened, begging for Kyle to respond. Then, at 1:04:17 a.m., the video came back for exactly 3 seconds. It showed Kyle's face in extreme close-up, like he was holding the camera right against his chin. His eyes were wide open, but looking at something above the camera, not at the lens. His mouth was moving rapidly, like he was speaking incredibly fast, but the only audio was that same phrase, "Don't turn off the light." The stream ended there, just cut to nothing. The chat stayed active for hours, people trying to figure out what they'd just witnessed. Someone called the Boston Police Department around 2 a.m. They said they couldn't do anything since Kyle was streaming from New Hampshire, so they contacted state police up there. It took them 3 days to find the hospital. Kyle had been careful not to reveal the exact location during his stream, to avoid getting in trouble for trespassing. When the police finally got to Whitmore State Hospital on December 11th, they found Kyle's car still parked outside, covered in frost. His streaming equipment was discovered in that same surgical suite, the camera still recording somehow, despite the battery supposedly only lasting 4 hours max. The memory card had 43 hours of footage on it. Impossible, since the card could only hold 16 hours. Most of it was just the empty room, but every few hours, you could hear Kyle's voice faintly saying that same phrase about the light. The really disturbing part was what they found when they checked the timestamp data. According to the camera's internal clock, it had been recording continuously since December 8th, but it showed dates jumping randomly, sometimes showing December 2022, sometimes March 1947, sometimes dates that hadn't happened yet. The police tech guy said it was probably a malfunction, but he'd never seen anything like it. They found Kyle's phone in the basement corridor, the screen cracked, but still functional. His streaming app was still open, showing 0 viewers and a stream duration of -17 hours, whatever that means. His backpack was in Whitmore's office, everything neatly arranged inside like he'd carefully packed it to leave. But Kyle himself was nowhere in the building. Here's where it gets worse and why I'm writing this. 5 days after they found his equipment, Kyle walked into a gas station in Concord, about 60 miles from the hospital. The security footage shows him entering at 3:47 a.m., walking straight to the counter, and asking the clerk to call someone for him. The clerk said Kyle couldn't remember his own phone number, couldn't remember how he'd gotten there, but kept insisting someone needed to turn the light back on at the hospital. The police picked him up, and he's been in psychiatric care since then. I visited him twice. The first time, he didn't recognize me at all, just kept drawing these detailed floor plans of the hospital on any paper he could find. The second time, last week, he grabbed my arm and said my name for the first time since they found him. He told me he remembered everything from that night, that he'd found more than just abandoned rooms in that basement. He said there were people still there, still working, still performing procedures. Not ghosts or whatever. Actual people who'd never left when the hospital closed. He said they've been living in sections of the building that aren't on any blueprint, spaces between the walls, continuing Whitmore's work. The doctors think it's trauma-induced psychosis. But Kyle gave me coordinates, specific measurements of where these hidden spaces are. I haven't told anyone else this, but I drove up there yesterday just to look from outside. The building's been completely demolished. Nothing left but an empty lot. The demolition order was dated December 7th, the day before Kyle's stream. The company that did it has no record of the job. The old Greystone State Hospital had been shuttered since 1987, but in March of 2016, I managed to get permission to spend 3 nights there for a documentary I was putting together about psychiatric institutions in the 1950s. At that point in my life, freelancing was barely paying my rent in Portland, and my apartment was basically a storage unit for old medical journals and declassified government documents. I'd been chasing stories like this since my 20s, and now, more than a decade into this career, I'd learned that the darker the history, the more people wanted to watch. I'd spent 6 months researching Greystone specifically because of the electroshock experiments they'd conducted there. Dr. Edmund Farrow had run a program that supposedly helped schizophrenic patients through intensive electrical therapy sessions, though most of his records had mysteriously disappeared after a patient named Dorothy Vance died under questionable circumstances in 1958. I arrived at Greystone on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 duffel bags full of recording equipment, 5 digital voice recorders, a camcorder, extra batteries, and enough protein bars to last me through the weekend. The building looked exactly like you'd expect an abandoned asylum to look, all peeling paint and broken windows, except for the electroshock ward on the 2nd floor, which had been preserved almost perfectly. Room 213 was where they'd done the actual procedures, and walking in there felt like stepping into a photograph from 60 years ago. The leather restraint chair was still bolted to the floor, the electrical panels still had their original dials and switches, and there was this observation window that looked in from the hallway, though someone had sealed it with industrial-grade adhesive at some point. My plan was simple enough: set up the recorders in different spots around the ward, let them run overnight and hopefully capture some ambient sound that would add atmosphere to the documentary. I placed one recorder on the metal tray table next to the restraint chair, another on the windowsill overlooking the courtyard, a third in the hallway just outside room 213, and the fourth near the old nurse's station. The fifth one I kept with me as backup. While I was setting everything up, I noticed something odd about the observation room behind that sealed window. There were scratch marks on the inside of the glass, like someone had been trying to claw their way out. The adhesive was yellowed with age but still solid, and according to the maintenance logs I'd found, that room had been sealed in 1959, right after Dorothy Vance's death. That first night I slept in what used to be the doctor's lounge down the hall, far enough from the electroshock ward that I wouldn't hear every little creak and groan of the old building. Around 2 a.m. I woke up because I thought I heard footsteps above me, but the third floor had collapsed years ago. There was literally nothing up there but exposed beams and pigeons. I checked my phone and saw that the recorders were still running, their little red lights blinking in the darkness when I peeked down the hallway. The building had this particular smell, like wet newspaper mixed with something medicinal that had soaked into the walls over decades. I went back to sleep telling myself that abandoned buildings make all kinds of noises, especially ones with this much history bleeding through the cracks. The next morning, I went to collect the recorders, eager to see if I'd captured anything useful. The first three were exactly where I'd left them, but when I got to the nurse's station, that recorder was on the floor, not on the desk where I'd placed it. The device was still recording, and when I picked it up, I noticed the battery was almost dead, even though I'd put in fresh ones the night before. I gathered all 4 devices and sat in the lounge with my laptop, transferring the audio files. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: settling wood, wind through broken windows, maybe some rats in the walls. But when I got to the recording from the device in room 213, the one on the metal tray table, I heard something that made me stop the playback and rewind. At 3:47 a.m., there was a woman's voice barely above a whisper reciting names: Dorothy Vance, Franklin Hewitt, Margaret Russo, Anthony Carmine. I recognized some of these from my research. They were all patients who'd undergone Dr. Farrow's experimental treatments between 1954 and 1958. The voice continued for about 2 minutes, listing maybe 15 or 16 names total. And then, at the very end, clear as day, she said my name: Brian Novak. The thing is, I'd never published under my real name, always used pseudonyms for my articles, and I definitely hadn't mentioned it to anyone at Greystone or even to the caretaker who'd let me in. The voice had this quality to it, like someone speaking through water or from very far away, but the names were unmistakably clear, especially mine. I played it back 3 more times, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe someone was playing a prank, but who would know those specific patient names? The historical records I'd found were scattered across different archives, some only available through Freedom of Information Act requests. I checked the other recordings from that same time frame, and they all had the usual ambient noise except for one detail. On the hallway recorder, about 5 minutes before the voice started listing names, there was the sound of a door opening. Not creaking or being forced, but opening normally, like someone with a key. The nurse's station recording, the one from the device I'd found on the floor, had captured something else entirely: rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on metal, that went on for nearly an hour, starting at exactly 3:42 a.m. I spent the rest of that day going through the hospital's old employee records that I'd photocopied from the state archives. There was no mention of any female staff member who'd worked closely with Dr. Farrow during those experiments, just 2 male orderlies and a male nurse named Christopher Dalton. But in the margins of one report from 1958, someone had penciled in a note: Mrs. F knows about the recordings in 213. Mrs. F. Could that have been Farrow's wife? I searched for any mention of her in the documents, but found nothing. The daylight was starting to fade, and I had to decide whether to pack up and leave or stay for the second night. I'd driven 4 hours to get here, had permission for 3 nights, and honestly, I needed this footage for my documentary. Against every instinct telling me to get out, I decided to stay and set up the recorders again, this time adding my backup fifth recorder inside room 213, right on the seat of the restraint chair. That second night, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat in the doctor's lounge with my laptop, reviewing more of the audio from the first night and cross-referencing patient names with the hospital's admission records. Around 1 a.m., I heard actual footsteps in the hallway, not above me this time, but on the same floor, moving slowly toward the electroshock ward. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check, but the hallway was empty. The recorders were still in place, their red lights creating tiny dots in the darkness. When I shined my light into room 213, the fifth recorder, the one I'd placed on the restraint chair, was now on the floor, face down. I know I'd secured it with gaffer tape because I didn't want it falling off during the night. The tape was still on the chair, torn cleanly down the middle like someone had pulled the device straight through it. I picked up the recorder and checked it, still running, but the display showed it had been recording for 7 hours, which was impossible since I'd only set it up 2 hours ago. The timestamp on the device had somehow jumped backward to the previous night. I was trying to make sense of this when I heard something that made me drop the recorder, a woman humming from inside the sealed observation room. Not a recording, not an echo, but actual humming coming from behind that adhesive-covered window. I put my ear against the sealed glass and could hear it more clearly. A lullaby. Something familiar but wrong, like the notes were slightly off-key. Then the humming stopped, and I heard breathing slow and deliberate, as if someone had their mouth pressed against the other side of the glass, exactly where my ear was. I jerked away from the window and ran back to the lounge, grabbing my equipment. I wasn't staying another minute in that place. As I threw everything into my bags, I realized one of the recorders was missing. The one from the metal tray table in room 213, the same one that had captured the woman's voice listing names the night before. I knew I should just leave it, but those devices cost $300 each, and I needed it. I went back to room 213 one last time, using my phone's flashlight since I'd already packed my good one. The recorder wasn't on the tray table, wasn't on the floor, wasn't anywhere in the room. But when I turned to leave, I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The adhesive seal on the observation window had been peeled back at one corner, just enough for someone to squeeze their fingers through. Fresh adhesive was dripping down the wall like honey. The next morning, after driving straight home without stopping, I got a call from the caretaker at Greystone. He said the state police had been called to the hospital because someone had broken into the sealed observation room. They'd found my missing recorder inside, along with my fingerprints on the interior walls and door handle. The thing is, that room had been sealed since 1959, and when they checked their records, they found that it had been sealed from the inside, not the outside. The caretaker said they also found something else in there, a box of old recordings, reel-to-reel tapes from the 1950s, each one labeled with a patient name. The last tape in the box had my name on it, written in pencil, and when they played it, it was 47 minutes of my own voice describing electroshock procedures I'd never researched, using medical terminology I didn't know, speaking as if I was Dr. Farrow himself, conducting a session on a patient named Brian Novak. The police wanted me to come in for questioning, but what could I tell them? That I'd never been inside that room. The fingerprint evidence said otherwise. My lawyer advised me to claim someone had lifted my prints and planted them, but even she didn't believe that explanation. The investigation went on for months, and during that time, I did my own research into Dr. Farrow's wife. Turns out her name was Frances, and she'd been a patient at Greystone before marrying Edmund Farrow in 1952. She'd been admitted for hysteria and auditory hallucinations. She claimed she could hear the thoughts of people who hadn't been born yet. The staff notes described her as unusually fixated on recording devices, and mentioned that she would spend hours talking into empty rooms, claiming she was leaving messages for the documentary maker. Frances Farrow died in 1959, the same year they sealed the observation room, apparently from a self-inflicted electrical burn sustained while trying to operate her husband's equipment alone. I never finished the documentary. The footage I shot at Greystone sits in a box in my closet, unwatched since that night. Sometimes I wonder if I should destroy it all, but I can't bring myself to do it. Last month I got a package with no return address. Inside was one of my recorders, the one the police said they'd kept as evidence. It had a recording on it dated from next year, April 2017, and it's my voice again, except I'm 70 years old in it, describing my treatment at Greystone and thanking Dr. Farrow for curing my temporal displacement disorder. The recording is 3 hours long, and at the end, I can hear that same woman's voice from the first night, except now I recognize it. It's Frances Farrow, and she's saying, "Session complete. Patient Brian Novak, admitted March 2016, discharged April 1959. Riverside Memorial's West Wing had broken air conditioning that late summer of 2015, making 12-hour shifts feel like an eternity in that psychiatric unit. After 11 years as a nurse there, most cases blurred together, but Natalie Foster stood out from the moment her husband Tom brought her through those doors. She was 34, had designed award-winning buildings before her breakdown, and Tom found her sitting in their bathtub, fully clothed, insisting she needed to practice being in a coffin. The intake paperwork listed severe dissociative disorder with depersonalization, but those clinical terms didn't capture the absolute conviction in her eyes when she told me during that first assessment that she had died in a car accident 3 years prior and was just a ghost pretending to be alive. She spoke about it so matter-of-factly, like explaining that the sky was blue or water was wet, and even showed me newspaper clippings she carried in her purse about various car accidents, pointing to random victims and claiming those were about her death. Dr. Warren Steinberg had been treating Natalie for 2 months when he proposed the exposure therapy that would change everything. That staff meeting still haunts me. The fluorescent lights humming overhead, the bitter taste of break room coffee, and the way my supervisor Karen kept clicking her pen nervously as Steinberg outlined his plan. He wanted to take Natalie down to the hospital morgue, let her see actual deceased bodies, force her to confront the difference between death and her current state. The theory sounded almost reasonable when he explained it with his charts and studies, talking about radical exposure therapy and breakthrough cases from some research hospital in Phoenix. But something in my gut twisted hard when he mentioned she'd need to spend extended periods there, not just minutes but hours at a time, 3 sessions per week minimum. Karen asked about ethics approval, and Steinberg produced a thick folder of paperwork, signatures from the board, consent forms that Tom had signed with tears streaming down his face, desperate to get his wife back to who she used to be. The first session happened on a Monday morning, and they assigned me to accompany them since Natalie trusted me more than the other nurses. The morgue was in the basement, past the loading docks where they brought supplies, down a long hallway with pipes running along the ceiling that dripped condensation onto the cracked linoleum floor. Dr. Coleman, the chief medical examiner, met us at the entrance wearing that perpetual frown he always had, clearly uncomfortable with the whole arrangement but bound by whatever agreement Steinberg had made with administration. Natalie walked between us like she was heading to a regular therapy appointment, even humming softly under her breath, some melody that sounded like a lullaby played backward. When Coleman opened the heavy metal door and that wave of cold, preservative-scented air hit us, Natalie actually smiled and said it felt like coming home. The room had 8 steel tables, 3 occupied by bodies covered in white sheets, and the fluorescent lights gave everything this bluish tinge that made even us living people look somewhat corpse-like. Steinberg instructed Natalie to sit in a chair he'd placed between 2 of the occupied tables, close enough that she could reach out and touch the sheets if she wanted. The first hour, she just sat there perfectly still, barely blinking while Steinberg took notes on his clipboard and asked her questions about what she was experiencing. She answered in this dreamy, disconnected voice, describing how familiar everything felt, how the bodies under the sheets were just like her, caught between worlds, pretending to be something they weren't. Around the 90-minute mark, She started having conversations with the covered corpses, not in a crazy, yelling way, but quiet, intimate whispers like she was sharing secrets with old friends. Steinberg seemed thrilled, scribbling faster in his notebook, muttering about breakthrough responses and cognitive dissonance markers. But watching Natalie lean toward that sheet-covered form, whispering earnestly to whoever she thought was listening underneath, made my stomach churn in a way that had nothing to do with the preserved flesh smell permeating that room. By the third week, Natalie had stopped eating regular meals, claiming dead people didn't need food, only surviving on the protein shakes Tom forced her to drink during his visits. The sessions had extended to 3 hours each, and Steinberg had gotten permission to leave her alone in the morgue for portions of that time, observing through a security camera while he reviewed notes upstairs. During one session in early September, while I waited outside the morgue doors on my break, I heard Natalie through the ventilation grate, not talking this time, but making these wet, rhythmic sounds like someone learning to breathe underwater. When I rushed inside, I found her pressing her face against one of the body bags that had arrived that morning, inhaling deeply through the plastic. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She told Steinberg later that she was trying to remember what death smelled like, trying to match her own scent to theirs. And he actually wrote this down like it was some kind of therapeutic breakthrough instead of a woman literally huffing corpse fumes through plastic. The changes in Natalie accelerated after that incident, transforming her from a confused but functional person into something else entirely. Her skin took on this grayish pallor that wasn't quite medical, but wasn't quite right either, and she started moving differently. These slow, deliberate gestures like she was underwater or operating her body by remote control. Tom stopped visiting after she told him he was talking to an echo, that the real Natalie was downstairs in drawer number 7, waiting to be properly buried. The other patients in the ward started avoiding her, claiming she smelled like formaldehyde even though she showered twice daily, scrubbing her skin until it was raw and bleeding in places. But Steinberg kept pushing forward with his sessions, now up to 4 hours at a time, bringing in fresh corpses for her to sit with, documenting her reactions as she traced her fingers along their cold faces, whispering questions none of us could quite make out, but that seemed to get answers only she could hear. The night everything fell apart started with a call from Coleman around 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in late September. Security had found the morgue door propped open with a wheelchair, and when they checked inside, they discovered Natalie had somehow gotten out of the locked ward and made her way down there alone. They found her lying on one of the empty steel tables, arms crossed over her chest, not breathing, or rather taking breaths so shallow that the security guard initially thought she was actually dead. When they tried to move her, she went rigid, every muscle locked in place like rigor mortis had set in, and it took 4 of us plus 2 orderlies to get her onto a gurney. The strangest part was her temperature, 76 degrees Fahrenheit when we finally got a reading, cold enough that she should have been in severe hypothermia, but her heart was still beating steady at 40 beats per minute. Steinberg arrived within the hour, furious about the security breach but fascinated by her condition, ordering warming blankets while simultaneously documenting what he called a death state achievement in his notes. For the next 2 days, Natalie remained in that state, cold, rigid, barely breathing but somehow still alive. She wouldn't respond to anyone, not even pain stimuli, just lay there with her eyes open but unfocused, pupils dilated so wide her brown irises looked black. Then on Friday afternoon, she suddenly sat up, turned to look directly at the empty space beside her bed, and started having a full conversation with someone who wasn't there. Not the confused rambling of psychosis, but actual back-and-forth dialogue, pausing to listen, nodding at responses, even laughing at something her invisible companion apparently said. She talked about the morgue like it was a waiting room, described the bodies as travelers preparing for a journey, and mentioned that the woman in drawer 7, the one she'd claimed was the real Natalie, had been teaching her things. When Karen asked what kinds of things, Natalie just smiled this serene, empty smile and said we wouldn't understand because we were still pretending to be alive, still playing the game of warmth and breath and heartbeat. After that incident, The hospital administration finally stepped in and terminated Steinberg's experimental treatment. But the damage was already done. Natalie had gone completely silent by early November. Wouldn't speak to anyone. Not the new psychiatrist they brought in. Not the nurses, not even Tom when he tried one last visit before filing for divorce. She would just sit in her room, positioned in the exact same spot every day, facing the corner where the walls met, moving her lips constantly like she was having conversations we couldn't hear. The new doctor, a woman named Dr. Lisa Thornton from Johns Hopkins, tried everything: antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, even electroconvulsive therapy with the family's consent. But nothing brought Natalie back from wherever she'd gone. The only time she showed any awareness of her surroundings was when they had to wheel her past the basement level in the elevator for medical tests. She would press her hands against the elevator walls and lean toward the doors, her whole body straining toward the morgue like a plant bending toward sunlight. 6 months later, in May of 2016, the call came during my morning shift. The night nurse, a new hire named Dennis who didn't know Natalie's full history, had found her missing from her room at the 4 a.m. check. Security footage showed her walking calmly out of the ward at 3:17 a.m. Somehow the door that was supposed to be locked had been left open by a maintenance worker fixing the air conditioning. They found her in the morgue, of course, sitting on the floor beside gurney number 7, the one she'd always claimed held the real Natalie. But here's the part that still keeps me awake at night. She wasn't alone down there, or at least she was having a complete two-sided conversation with someone. And when they reviewed the security footage later, they could see her clearly responding to something, looking at a specific spot next to her, even reaching out to touch something that wasn't there. The audio picked up her side of the conversation perfectly, talking about finally being ready, about understanding what comes next, about how the waiting was over. When they tried to get Natalie to stand up and leave the morgue, she went into that rigid state again, but this time it was different. Her body temperature read 68 degrees, and her pulse was barely detectable, maybe 20 beats per minute. Dr. Thornton made the decision to let her stay there while they monitored her vitals, thinking that forcing her to leave might cause complete cardiac arrest. For 3 hours, Natalie sat beside that empty gurney, occasionally nodding, sometimes smiling, her lips moving in constant conversation with whoever she believed was there. Then at 7:23 a.m. she suddenly stood up, walked to the middle of the room, and announced in a clear, strong voice, the first word she'd spoken in months, that she understood now, that the woman in drawer 7 had explained everything, that dying wasn't about stopping but about transitioning, and that she'd been doing it wrong by trying to force it. She said she needed to wait for her appointment, that everyone had one, and hers was coming soon. Before anyone could respond, she walked calmly back to the psychiatric ward with us, allowed herself to be admitted to her room, and sat in her usual corner spot, returning to her silent state. That was 8 years ago, and Natalie is still there in that same ward, in that same corner, having those same silent conversations with someone only she can see. She's become something of a legend among the staff, the patient who spent so much time with the dead that she forgot how to be alive. New nurses always ask about her, especially when they notice how she never seems to age quite right, how her skin maintains that slightly gray pallor no matter how much sunlight she gets during outdoor therapy, how her body temperature never quite reaches normal. Dr. Thornton left after 2 years, said she couldn't explain what happened to Natalie medically or psychiatrically. Steinberg lost his license after an investigation revealed he'd falsified some of his research data, though he still writes papers about Natalie's case from his retirement in Florida. And me? I transferred to pediatric care after that last incident. Couldn't handle walking past that basement entrance every day, knowing what happened down there. But sometimes when I work night shifts and pass by the psychiatric ward, I wonder if Natalie is still sitting in that corner, still whispering to her invisible companion, still waiting for that appointment she mentioned. And what exactly will happen when it finally arrives? That summer of 1982 changed everything about how I see psychiatric care. Pinewood Behavioral Center sat in rural Pennsylvania, 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by endless cornfields and gravel roads that turned into thick mud whenever storm clouds rolled through. I'd been working there for about 3 months as a nurse. At 23, it was my first real job after finishing school. Most of the staff lived on site in converted dormitories from when the building served as a tuberculosis sanatorium back in the 40s. The isolation wing where I worked had 12 padded rooms, though we rarely used more than 3 or 4 at a time. My supervisor, a woman named Judith with steel gray hair and a perpetual coffee stain on her scrubs, told me during my first week that the isolation rooms were a last resort, only for patients who posed immediate danger to themselves or others. I believed her then, trusted the system, trusted that everything we did was for the patient's benefit. The patient they called Jimmy, though his real name was James Whitfield, had been with us for 6 months when everything went wrong. He was 31, diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder, and had these episodes where he'd pace the halls for hours muttering numbers in sequences that never repeated. He wasn't violent, just confused most days, always asking about his sister who died in a car accident 5 years before his admission. On that Friday afternoon in August, Jimmy had gotten agitated during group therapy when another patient started screaming about seeing bugs crawling under his skin. The charge nurse, a guy named Carl who always smelled like menthol cigarettes and had worked there since the 60s, decided Jimmy needed time in isolation to calm down. I remember thinking it was excessive. Jimmy was just scared, covering his ears and rocking in his chair. But Carl outranked me, and questioning senior staff wasn't something a new nurse did if she wanted to keep her job. The storm hit around 7 that evening, just as I was helping Carl escort Jimmy to room 9 in the isolation wing. The hallway lights flickered while we walked, and Jimmy kept stopping every few steps, pressing his palms flat against the walls like he was trying to feel for vibrations. "The numbers are wrong today," he kept saying, his voice barely above a whisper. 7, 14, 21, but then it skips to 23. Why does it skip? Carl just grabbed his arm harder, practically dragging him the last few feet. Room 9 had padding that went up 8 feet on every wall, yellowed foam that had absorbed decades of sweat and fear and God knows what else. The observation window in the door was reinforced with wire mesh, and there was a single overhead light protected by a metal cage. Protocol said we had to remove Jimmy's shoes, belt, and anything else he could use to hurt himself. He cooperated, even folded his clothes neatly and handed them to me. But his eyes never left that caged light fixture. By 8:30, the storm had knocked out half the county's power grid, and our backup generators kicked in with a grinding mechanical wheeze that echoed through the whole building. I was doing rounds in the main ward when the lights went completely dark for about 10 seconds. Not just dim, but absolute blackness that made you lose all sense of where you were standing. When the emergency power finally stabilized, only about half the lights came back on, casting these long, distorted shadows down every corridor. The administrator, Mr. Donovan, called an emergency meeting in the cafeteria. He had this thin mustache he was always touching when he got nervous, and that night, he couldn't stop fidgeting with it. "We're running on limited power until morning," he announced to the skeleton crew of maybe 15 staff members. "Priority goes to the medical wing, the pharmacy, and the main nurses' stations. Non-essential areas will remain dark." Someone asked about the isolation wing, and Donovan waved his hand dismissively. "Those rooms are secure. The patients there will be fine until morning. We'll resume normal protocols once power is restored." I tried to speak up, told him we had Jimmy in room 9 who'd just been admitted to isolation that afternoon, but Donovan cut me off. "The isolation wing has been used for decades without power," he said, that condescending tone creeping into his voice. "Those rooms are designed to be safe even in complete darkness. No one can hurt themselves in there." Carl backed him up, mentioned how in the old days before proper electrical systems, they'd keep patients in those rooms for days with just candlelight in the hallways. But something gnawed at me. The way Jimmy had stared at that caged light, the way he'd been counting, always counting. Around midnight, I tried to go check on him anyway, but the corridor to the isolation wing was pitch black, and my flashlight beam barely penetrated 3 feet into that thick darkness. The emergency exits at both ends of the wing had been sealed with chains and padlocks years ago after a patient escaped, so there was only one way in or out. I stood at the threshold for maybe 5 minutes, calling Jimmy's name into the void, but all I heard was the rain hammering against the roof and this weird metallic creaking sound, like pipes expanding and contracting. Saturday crawled by in a haze of emergency protocols and barely controlled chaos. Without proper lighting, half the patients refused to leave their rooms, and the ones who did wandered the dim hallways like ghosts, bumping into walls and crying. We had 2 medical emergencies that nearly turned fatal because we couldn't find supplies fast enough in the dark storage rooms. I kept asking Carl when we could check on the isolation wing, but he brushed me off every time. "Those rooms are soundproof," he'd say. "Even if they're yelling, we wouldn't hear them. They're safer in there than out here with all this confusion." But I noticed he never went near that corridor himself, always found reasons to be on the opposite side of the building. The generators sputtered and coughed all day, threatening to die completely several times. Judith showed me the isolation log from the night shift. The last entry for room 9 was my signature from when we'd admitted Jimmy at 7:47 p.m. Friday. No one had been back since. "It's protocol during power emergencies," she explained, but her voice had this uncertain edge. "We maintain minimum contact to preserve resources." Sunday morning, the power finally came back on at 6:14 a.m. I was in the break room when the fluorescent lights buzzed to life, so bright after 2 days of shadows that everyone had to shield their eyes. Immediately, I headed for the isolation wing, but Carl intercepted me in the main hallway. "We'll do rounds together," he said, but something in his expression had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by this tight nervousness around his mouth. The isolation corridor looked different in the full light. Water had leaked through the ceiling tiles during the storm, creating these dark brown stains that spread across the floor in weird patterns. The air smelled wrong too, metallic and sweet at the same time, like copper pennies mixed with rotting fruit. When we got to room 9, Carl fumbled with his keys, dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door. "Jimmy?" he called out before opening it. No response. The door swung inward, and I saw Carl's whole body go rigid. He blocked the doorway with his arm when I tried to look inside. "Get Donovan," he said, his voice barely steady, "and call the state police. Don't let anyone else near this wing." Through the gap under Carl's arm, I caught a glimpse of the room that still visits me in nightmares 40 years later. Jimmy was in the corner, curled into himself, completely still. The padding on the walls, that yellowed foam I'd noticed Friday night, had been torn apart in long vertical strips, like something with claws had raked down them over and over. But it was the bruises that made my throat close up. Purple-black marks covered every visible inch of Jimmy's skin, perfect oval shapes like fingerprints, but the spacing was all wrong, too wide to be from normal hands. His own fingernails were torn and bloody, some completely missing, and there were deep scratches across his face and neck that formed patterns, almost like symbols or letters I couldn't read. The overhead light, the one in the metal cage he'd stared at so intently, was shattered. Glass shards covered the floor, each piece reflecting the harsh fluorescent light from the hallway. On the wall opposite the door, drawn in what looked like blood, were numbers: 7, 14, 21, 23, 23, 23, repeated over and over until they covered the entire surface. But the thing that haunts me most was the position of his body, pressed into that corner like he was trying to push himself through the wall to escape something we couldn't see. The state police arrived within an hour, followed by investigators from the Department of Health. They sealed off the entire isolation wing, took photographs from every angle, measured the bruises, the scratches, documented every number on the wall. The detective in charge, a woman with prematurely gray hair named Detective Reeves, interviewed me for 3 hours straight. She kept coming back to the timeline. When exactly had the lights gone out? Who had made the decision not to check the isolation rooms? Why had it taken 48 hours before anyone entered room 9? I told her about the power outage, about Donovan's orders, about Carl refusing to let anyone near the wing. She wrote everything down in this small spiral notebook, occasionally stopping to examine photos they'd taken of Jimmy's injuries. "These bruise patterns," she said at one point, showing me a close-up image that made my stomach turn. "The medical examiner says they're consistent with restraint marks, but the positioning doesn't make sense. They're on parts of his body he couldn't have reached himself, and they're too uniform to be from a struggle." She paused, tapping her pen against the notebook. "And there's no evidence anyone else entered that room after you and Carl locked him in Friday night. What they found when they investigated further was somehow worse than the scene itself. The security logs, which ran on battery backup, showed that the door to room 9 had never been opened between Friday evening and Sunday morning. The electronic lock registered my keycard at 7:47 p.m. Friday, and then Carl's at 6:31 a.m. Sunday, with nothing in between. But the cameras, the ones that should have been recording the hallway outside the isolation wing, had been deliberately disabled. Not by the power outage. Someone had cut the cables inside the security office Thursday night, before Jimmy was even put in isolation. The maintenance logs showed something else strange. A work order from 2 weeks earlier to inspect the electrical system in room 9, specifically the overhead light fixture. The work was signed off as completed by a maintenance worker named Paul Garrett, but when they tried to find him, HR discovered he'd quit suddenly the day after finishing the job, left no forwarding address, cleared out his on-site apartment in the middle of the night. His employment file had a note from Judith about concerning behavior and inappropriate interest in patient histories, but no one had followed up on it. The investigation went on for weeks, but they never found Paul Garrett. What they did find, hidden in the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the isolation wing, made everyone involved wish they hadn't looked. There was a makeshift living space down there. A mattress, canned goods, bottles of water, and hundreds of photographs tacked to the pipes. Pictures of patients in the isolation rooms, taken through tiny holes that had been drilled through the floors. Some photos went back years, showing patients who'd been discharged or transferred long ago. But there were also journals, dozens of them, filled with observations about the patients, their behaviors, their fears. Jimmy's name appeared frequently in the most recent entries. Garrett had been watching him for months, documenting his number sequences, his mentions of his dead sister. The final entry, dated the day after Garrett supposedly quit, just said, "Room 9 is prepared. The connection is complete. He'll understand when the lights go out." The police theorized that Garrett had rigged something in the electrical system, maybe some kind of remote access to the room, but they never found evidence of how he could have gotten in and out without the door opening. Jimmy survived, if you can call it that. He never spoke again, never made eye contact with anyone, just sat in the corner of whatever room they put him in, drawing numbers on his palms with his finger. Always that same sequence, 7, 14, 21, 23. They transferred him to a state facility in New Jersey, and I heard later that he died there in 1987, cardiac arrest in his sleep. The official investigation concluded that he'd suffered a severe psychotic break during the isolation, exacerbated by the darkness and the storm, and had somehow inflicted all those injuries on himself, despite the physical impossibility of it. Pinewood Behavioral Center closed 6 months after the incident. Not because of Jimmy. Officially, it was due to budget cuts and failing infrastructure, but those of us who worked there knew the truth. After what happened in room 9, none of the staff would go near the isolation wing. Patients started refusing treatment. Families pulled their relatives out. The place just died. They demolished the building in 1984, but before they did, I went back one last time. The isolation wing door was chained shut, but through a gap I could see down that hallway. On the floor, barely visible in the dust and debris, were footprints leading to and from room 9. Fresh footprints, even though the building had been empty for over a year. I never went back after that, never tried to find out more. Some questions don't need answers. Some doors should stay locked. I never thought I'd step inside Westridge Psychiatric again, at least not as a patient. Years ago, I worked there as a night nurse. 12-hour shifts filled with screams, sudden code calls, and the strange calm that came just before dawn. After a rough divorce and a spiral that left me barely functioning, I signed myself in. It was humiliating, walking through those same sliding doors with a wristband instead of a key card, seeing familiar corridors through the eyes of someone on the other side. The fluorescent light still buzzed, same sterile hum, same faint smell of antiseptic and burned coffee. The first few nights were ordinary, or as ordinary as they can be in a place like that. My room was on the east wing, quiet, except for the constant murmur of the air vents. I told myself it was the HVAC system, the same one I'd heard hundreds of times during shifts. But one night, lying awake around 3 a.m., I realized the sound wasn't steady. It rose and fell, like a voice struggling to form words. I pressed my ear closer to the vent above my bed, and for a moment I could swear I heard someone crying, soft, broken sobs fading in and out of the metallic echo. The next morning I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was another patient crying somewhere down the hall, the sound bouncing through the ducts. Still, it lingered in my head all day, that rhythm, that desperation. Later, while I sat in the common area coloring to keep my hands busy, I caught another sound coming from the vent above the TV, a man whispering something I couldn't quite make out. The other patients didn't seem to notice. When I asked one of the orderlies about it, he gave me a blank stare and said the vents hadn't worked in years. Central system's been dead since the fire, he added, walking off like it was nothing. That night, I moved my mattress closer to the wall under the vent. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't slipping back into the same hallucinations that had landed me there. I waited in the dark, eyes on the faint green glow of the exit sign. Around the same hour, the whispering began again, clearer this time. A woman's voice trembling, pleading for someone named Dr. Lang. Then a deeper voice snapped back, harsh, commanding. I knew that tone. It was the same one I'd heard from the old head psychiatrist years ago during emergency evaluations. Except, Dr. Lang had died almost 20 years earlier. By the fifth night, sleep had become impossible. Every time the building went still, the vents filled with voices, sometimes sobbing, sometimes laughter, sometimes long stretches of silence broken by sudden bursts of shouting. It wasn't random noise. It sounded like entire conversations cut into fragments. I started recognizing certain tones, the way someone gasped or hesitated, as if these were real people trapped in a loop. I tried recording it with the small tape player they gave me for therapy notes, but every playback was blank, just static, and the hum of the fluorescent lights. I reported it to the staff the following morning, expecting someone to at least check the ducts. Instead, they called the attending psychiatrist, Dr. Hillman, who smiled too easily and told me I was projecting unresolved trauma. Within an hour, they adjusted my medication and moved me to another wing, the one furthest from the East Hall. The walls there were thicker, newer, painted pale green instead of the faded beige I knew. For a while it worked. No whispers, no crying, just the low rattle of the heating system. But the quiet wasn't comforting. It felt staged, like a recording had simply been paused. One afternoon, during occupational therapy, a maintenance worker came by to fix a flickering light. I asked him if he'd ever heard voices through the vents in the old wing. He laughed softly and said, "Lady, those vents haven't carried air since before I started here." I pressed him for more, and his face changed. His eyes dropped to the floor. "There used to be a tape system for observation," he said, almost whispering. "Back when they recorded patient sessions, they fed the wires through the same ducts, but that was before they sealed them." Then he realized he'd said too much and packed his tools faster than I could ask anything else. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew where the old observation room was, behind the locked storage area near the east exit. I waited until lights out, then slipped out with a flashlight I'd hidden in my pillowcase. The hall was dead quiet except for the distant creak of pipes cooling. When I reached the old door, I noticed the padlock was new, shiny compared to the corroded hinges. I hesitated for a long time before pushing the light through a small gap near the handle. The beam landed on a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting on a metal shelf, coated in dust, but still plugged in. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding, listening to the low hum of something alive behind that door. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement inside, like the reflection of someone pacing slowly. But when I leaned closer, the sound returned. The same woman's voice I'd heard through the vents, pleading again for Dr. Lang. It wasn't coming from the room itself, but from deep within the wall, traveling through metal and plaster. The air felt charged, like a storm was building somewhere underground. I went to the nurse's station, trying to explain what I'd found, but before I could finish, they called for security. The orderlies led me back to my room, injected something clear into my IV, and told me to rest. I remember drifting in and out, the ceiling above me bending slightly each time I blinked. Somewhere between sleep and waking, I heard the same whispering start again, but this time the voices said my name. They spoke softly, almost kindly, as if welcoming me back. When I woke up, I was in a different room, smaller, windowless, walls painted white. Dr. Hillman told me I'd had an episode, and that I'd be discharged soon if I cooperated, but something about his tone felt rehearsed, the way he avoided eye contact when I asked about the East Wing. A few days later, during my final evaluation, a young intern accidentally handed me the wrong folder. It contained maintenance logs from the old ventilation system. The last entry dated 15 years before I was ever hired. The note beside it read, "Vent ducts permanently sealed after audio monitoring discontinued. Tapes archived in storage C." I was released a week later. I tried to put it behind me, to tell myself it was all part of the breakdown, a mind trying to make sense of static. But every now and then, when the house is quiet and the air conditioner kicks in, I swear I can still catch it. Faint, somewhere in the hiss of the vents. A voice, soft and cracked, repeating my name the way it did that night. It always stops after the same 3 words, "We hear you." The hospital cafeteria smelled like bleach and boiled vegetables most days. I'd been working there for 3 months, doing whatever needed to be done, cleaning trays, changing linens, helping nurses move patients who were too weak to stand. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid just enough for rent and gas, and in a town like ours, that counted as stability. The place was old, built in the 1950s, with peeling paint that no one ever bothered to fix because the funding's coming next quarter. Everyone said that every quarter. My shift usually started at noon, but the supervisor liked to shuffle schedules without notice. That's how I ended up in the nutrition ward one afternoon. The hallway there was quieter than anywhere else, lined with faded murals of fruits and smiling kids that looked more like ghosts than encouragement. The staff said it was part of a dietary research program, but the kids inside barely spoke, and the ones who did sounded too tired to finish sentences. There was one girl who caught my attention almost immediately. Her name was Emily. She couldn't have been more than 11, with hair so light it looked white under the fluorescent lights. Her chart said she was on a restricted protein intake trial. She'd always greet me when I brought in her tray, even if it was just boiled rice or some flavorless broth. Her voice was soft, like she was saving every word for when it really mattered. I started timing my cleaning rounds to match her meal times, just so I could talk to her a little. Over the next couple of weeks, Emily got thinner. Her wrists looked fragile, like the hospital band alone could bruise her. I mentioned it once to a nurse named Dana, who told me not to worry. The doctors are monitoring everything. But the doctors never came around when I was there. The only people I saw were interns with clipboards, and these black binders they never let out of their sight. Every note they took felt rehearsed, like they already knew the answers before asking any questions. One day, I walked into the ward and her bed was empty. The sheets were folded, the pillow perfectly centered, and her chart was gone from the wall slot. I assumed she'd been moved to another unit, but when I asked around, the answers didn't make sense. Dana said she'd been transferred for observation, yet nobody could tell me to which floor. When I checked the patient log, her name wasn't there at all. It was as if Emily had never been admitted. That night, I stayed past my shift under the excuse of restocking supplies. Around 2 a.m., the hall lights dimmed to half brightness, and the whole floor turned unnervingly still. I crept toward the office the interns used, the one with the frosted glass window. Inside, I could hear muffled voices, 2 men and a woman, discussing reclassification and non-compliance. Then someone mentioned the girl who failed the intake protocol. I didn't need a name to know who they were talking about. When the door opened, I ducked into the storage room across the hall. They wheeled out a stretcher covered in a thin white sheet, and the shape beneath it was far too small to be an adult. I caught a glimpse of a pale wrist with the hospital band still on. I couldn't see the name, but I recognized the faded blue ink stain near the edge. Emily had accidentally marked it with her pen one day when she drew a little flower for me on her napkin. My throat went dry. They were taking her through the back corridor that led straight to the basement. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went straight to records. The clerk, a guy named Ellis who'd been there for decades, told me the nutrition ward files were restricted by administration. I asked why a child's file would be classified like that. He leaned closer and said quietly, "Those kids aren't admitted under pediatrics. They're under research subjects." That word, subjects, hit harder than anything else he could have said. That afternoon, I went back to the ward pretending to deliver linens. The air there felt heavier, and I noticed one of the doors, Emily's old room, had been repainted a shade darker than the rest. On the table inside, there was a new tray of untouched food and a different name tag. But the smell lingered, the same faint antiseptic mixed with something sour, like spoiled formula. I couldn't stay long before one of the interns spotted me and told me that area was off limits until further notice. Her tone was polite, but her eyes said, "Get out now." A few days later, the hospital released an internal memo saying a child from the nutrition ward had died of complications due to malnutrition. The note didn't mention her by name. The next morning, the trial banners outside were gone, replaced by posters about community wellness programs. I overheard staff whispering that the diet research wasn't officially approved by the ethics board. The funding had come from a private sponsor whose name nobody seemed to know. Everyone acted like nothing had happened, but the ward stayed half empty after that. I tried filing a report through the patient advocacy office, but they told me my account didn't align with official documentation. I asked if I could at least talk to the attending physician listed on her case, and the clerk said that doctor had resigned the same week the memo went out. When I pressed for more information, they threatened to terminate my position for violating confidentiality protocols. That's when I realized they weren't trying to hide a mistake. They were covering up a pattern. I quit 2 weeks later. Before leaving, I found one of Emily's drawings tucked under a stack of diet logs. Just a tiny flower sketched in blue ink. I kept it folded in my wallet for years. Every now and then I still check the news, hoping someone will uncover what really happened in that ward. But there's never been a single article, not even a mention. Maybe that's the most disturbing part, how something so cruel can happen right in front of everyone and still vanish without a trace.